everybody. My name is Mihai Kamasan. I am the president of your PPE Student Association, as well as the UBCO Running Meat Society undergraduate chapter here on campus. And I'm very excited to welcome you all to our second iteration of this PPE panel discussion series. It has truly been a pleasure and an honor, as well as a formative learning experience for me to work so closely with our EPB department professors to bring you the best in constructive conversation on contested issues over the past few years. I'm proud to be on this leading edge, so to speak, of our department's commitment to the value of free academic inquiry, and I've been consistently impressed with our openness and engagement with difficult subjects as part of a community here at UBCO. So thank you very much for your attendance and for your meaningful participation. It is by interacting like this, I believe, unafraid of the specter of disagreement and desiring to listen, question, and critique, that we become better academics, thinkers, speakers, writers, and citizens for ourselves and for a better global future. Before we begin, I would like to invite you all to please join me in thanking, first of all, the executive members of our team who give their time to make events like these possible. Amar Kaira, Tade Hagarian, Adrian Cron, Tyler Washington, and our junior executives this year, Alex Ozarov and Charlotte Tappan. So thank you very much, as well as to Dr. Siglet, Dr. Garner, Dr. Irvin, Dr. Epperly, and Dr. Craig for their continued support and for their efforts to connect UBCO to esteemed institutions and speakers to further our learning, and of course to the rest of our professors as well. So thank you. Without any further ado tonight, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Adrian, and who will moderate tonight's event and give us some more information on our subject tonight. So thank you very much again for attending, and enjoy the evening.
Yeah, thank you, Mihai, for this wonderful introduction. Let me begin with introducing our panelists today. We have Dr. Garner, Professor of Philosophy, Dr. Ruiz, Professor of International Relations, and Dr. Campbell, teaches history here, Professor of History. And yeah, I'm very glad that we could all come together today. I will give us a short overview of our discussion today. We will first define and discuss what neutrality means, where it came from maybe, and then I will introduce two little short case studies on Ukraine and Yemen to further our discussion and to relate it to real-world conflicts. Towards the end of the event, we will have time for questions and open discussions, depending on how long we take up on our talk. Okay, without further ado, we could start. Yeah, what is state neutrality? Maybe Dr. Campbell, you want to give us a little historic background on what it means or meant in the past?
I would be happy to have a go. Does that come across? Yeah. I would almost start, and some of you might be familiar with my cynicism, by saying that neutrality is a concept much like virtue. We like to believe it exists, but in practical terms, it's harder to define. And I think, at least if we go quite literally back in the Western tradition to Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, to understandings of Roman statecraft, it's almost self-interest prevails over just about all else. And that's maybe nothing, again, to be cynical, as too much change. So when we look deeper and closer to neutrality in practice in the modern period, it is rather self-serving, depending upon where one fits in the spectrum. The classic examples of perhaps Switzerland, Sweden, the First World War, Second World War experiences would make the concept of neutrality a lot more pragmatic than something that we would actually see expressed clearly as international law.
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe Dr. Garner, a legal definition or moral definition on neutrality?
Sure. I suppose it's somewhat rare that I'm not the most cynical person. So I just want to point out that So let's start with the legal understanding, and maybe the best way to start is to point out some of our errors. Diogenes of Sinope like to say that first unlearn your mistakes. So neutrality is not something like not having a view. So for example, many of you came into this room quite interested. How many, when you walked through that door, could tell us that there are currently 45 armed conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa? You know, probably none of you. That doesn't make you neutral, you're just unaware of the facts. You have no view about the case, so I wouldn't say that you're neutral. So being neutral and not having a position should not be confused. Neutrality is closer to something like a policy choice or a principled position, maybe a cynical one, but it's something you choose. It's not something that just happens to you. But it's also important to understand that neutrality is a bundle of rights and duties. So in international law, some of this is actually quite clear. The clarity has emerged largely in the 19th and 20th century with what is largely the codification of international law. But the basic point is between things like the Hague Convention and the Geneva Conventions, we actually have a pretty clear idea of what's expected. So, to put it briefly, a neutral state has the right to immunity. Its territory, whether the land, territorial waters, and the airspace, cannot be used, and cannot be attacked. Its members of the community are also immune to attack. But let's be clear, this immunity is conditional. If the state, as an actor, violates that neutrality, it opens itself up to retaliation and therefore involvement in the conflict. Immunity is not immune to action or the consequences of your own choices. More specifically, also, it's worth pointing out that individual members must be distinguished from the state. So if we were to imagine that Switzerland is neutral and Alexander is a Swiss citizen, if he were to travel east and join a Ukrainian battalion, he would no longer enjoy the benefits of neutrality, but his fellow Swiss citizens who have not acted so would still retain it. We could get into some of the technicalities of what neutrality means, but in terms of international law, it's actually quite clear how it affects things like jus in bello, so something like the law of armed conflict. Just to quickly end up on the moral aspect, of course, the great debate is something like how do you justify neutrality? And I think we'll get into that probably later on. And what I hope to impress upon you is that while there might be very good criticisms of neutrality, I think you'd be surprised just how ugly abolishing neutrality would be.
Okay, thank you so much. A quick note, the mic is not working really well, so speak as loud as possible, please, without screaming. Dr. Ruiz, maybe a perspective from international relations. What does it mean in international relations today or in the past to be neutral?
Well, I think the first two speakers hit on a lot of what I was planning on saying. But I just want to add maybe one wrinkle, which actually might turn out to be a rather large wrinkle. So Dr. Garner had mentioned the Hague Convention. So you have Section 5 and 13, which outline the responsibilities and duties. Can you guys hear me? Which outline the responsibilities and duties, as he indicates, of neutral powers. But another way that we might think about neutrality, which applies to some of the conflicts we're going to talk about, in particular Ukraine, is this concept of qualified neutrality. And so you have on one hand what Dr. Garner has laid out, which is a kind of strictly positivist view of what neutrality means in international law. But some of you who took my Intro to IR class will remember reading about the Grotian conception of international society. And one might think about international law not only as a set of conventions or treaties that have been agreed upon explicitly or even implicitly, right? So a convention that we have in, well, at least we have in the United States. I don't know how you guys do it up here, but we have a thing called a line, right? You go to Starbucks and you get in line. Why do you do that? Is it a law? No, you just have done it for a while, right? It's a convention. So you have explicit treaties that are made, agreements that are signed, conventions, but you might also have something that you might call the natural law. And you might use that to determine which side in a conflict is behaving unjustly, who is infringing the rights of another country. And on that basis, a state like the United States in Ukraine might say, well, we're neutral in the sense that we are not going to involve ourselves in the armed conflict with Russia. We're not going to start bombing Moscow. However, we are going to supply Ukraine with military equipment, funds. We're going to supply them with intelligence. All of this is not allowed under international law if you are a neutral power. So the second the United States starts shipping Javelin, anti-tank systems and Abrams tanks, it's no longer a neutral power. You can't do that. But the United States makes the argument and says, well, we can do it because Russia has transgressed the sort of law of nations. It has committed an injustice, and so we have a duty to ensure that international society is preserved by acting in favor of Ukraine. Now, you can see explicit iterations of this in international law. So when you look, so Switzerland, for instance, you guys probably know this is a famously neutral country. Okay, Switzerland joined the UN in 2002, right? Which is to say, it had a problem with joining the UN because it was neutral. And joining the UN actually presents some complications, because when you join the UN, you assert that you're going to obey the Security Council when it meets, as it did in the case of the Korean War, and says there's a threat to peace around the globe. We're calling on all of the members of the United Nations to supply equipment and personnel to combat that threat to the peace. And that happens in the Korean War. It hasn't happened over Ukraine. Why? Because Russia's a member of the Security Council, right? So a treaty like this prevents states from sort of claiming neutrality in all cases, like Switzerland used to, since 1815 until, I guess, 2002, right? Or you have the Kellogg-Briand Pact, right? 1928, 29. Major powers signed this pact to renounce war as an instrument. But the pact also says if one of us engages in war, we lose the benefits of this. And so the idea is that all of the other powers are going to sort of respond with force. So there's an extra element here that's not merely a positivist element. So when we think about international law, we might think, oh, well, there's a code somewhere, or there's a body of knowledge. But also we have to consult, unfortunately, this very vague term related to perhaps to virtue, justice, right? And what is just under the natural law in and of itself. And so, am I making sense to you guys? I guess you can ask later.
Thank you so much. I think we will touch on Ukraine and other conflicts more later too. I forgot to mention we have a Menti board, so if you guys have questions, you can scan it and ask questions if you'd like, and we will come to them towards the end. Okay, we have kind of defined what state neutrality might mean. What does it not mean? When are political intervention and action constitute the line between neutral and non-neutral? And when does lack of intervention become completely? Dr. Garner, would you like to start?
Sure. I suppose perhaps I'll start by spelling out that I never said America should not intervene in a place like Ukraine. I'm just pointing out that if you're going to claim the right of neutrality, there are things you must do. There's rights and duties. You might say you want to be part of a conflict, and you might appeal to natural law. You might appeal to positive law. You can appeal to many things to justify a war or participation in it. But if we're just talking about what neutrality means, neutrality does mean you can't directly supply arms, but actually it's far short of that. You cannot directly participate. So few would think that supplying massive financial aid or petrol or other war-making materials would constitute respect for neutral action. So the basic idea is what neutrality is not is equal treatment. So for example, if Russia has a free trade agreement with a state A, and then it enters a war, the idea is not that somehow state A has to abolish its free trade agreement or create one with the other party in the conflict. Basically, your non-war-making activities, status quo ante, in other words, the status before the war, you can keep those going. So you have trade relations, you might have research agreements between universities, all those things are allowed to continue. That's not a violation of neutrality. You can argue it's repugnant, you can say it's bad, but if we're talking about actual neutrality, that's not it. Neutrality, violation of neutrality are direct participation in the conflict. So that's, to be perfectly clear, and that can be, weapons are certainly a case, that's sufficient, but it's not necessary. Short of weapons, you can violate neutrality. Sharing intelligence might be a case where you're not sharing material, but it's still relevant to what neutrality would not be. So I think I'll stop there for the time being.
And maybe Dr. Ruiz, if you want to respond or add to
I don't have a response. I agree with all you said. I was just adding on to it because there's this weird tension in this concept of neutrality, right? We might think about it as merely this legal thing, but practitioners, right, will talk about neutrality in other ways. So there's a tension between a positivist tradition in international law and a Grotian tradition, which explicitly incorporates natural law. And so we have to be aware of that when we think about neutrality, is all I want to add, because it becomes a much more complicated thing.
Dr. Campbell, maybe if you want to add anything to that, and why do countries choose to intervene in international conflict, and why, or historical, why do they choose to do that?
I think the critical thing, again, without being too deeply cynical, is to calculate self-interest. And if you are thinking in terms of what is in your best interest, and I think the way to perhaps frame this in historical context is to look at conflicts that became great wars, the First World War, the Second World War. Where did the concept of neutrality fit into these wider conflicts as they evolved? Even before the outbreak of war in 1914, there was very much a recognition that Europe was sort of, at least the two alliances were moving towards a confrontation. And the great concern was neutral rights in international law. That was right after the conclusion of the Crimean War, the Declaration of Paris, which tried to codify what were really shipping rights, because those are sort of the first casualty of war, at least in terms of the ability of the Royal Navy of Britain to intervene, blockade, cut off commerce and trade. That becomes an important issue in the American Civil War, and the British just managed to restrain themselves from intervening to open up access to the cotton supplied by the American South. Probably, in hindsight, a rather wise decision by the British. But the codification of neutral shipping rights came to the fore in 1909. Declaration of London, again, there was an international agreement, which was subsequently not agreed to in the House of Lords in 1914 by Britain, because it was thought that this would reduce the ability of Britain to exert its power, particularly the power of the Royal Navy in warfare. But they had sort of described what was contraband, what you couldn't as a neutral trade in wartime. So there were materials that could be used directly in war. There were materials that might be dual use, so perhaps restrict trade in food that would be vital to a war activity. Restrict trade in some dual use, as we call them, technologies or materials. You could restrict use, but you couldn't entirely prohibit what was called a free list. Yet as soon as the war broke out, certainly by 1914, the British, the French, just about everybody else sort of threw overboard these principles of legal contraband, just sort of asserted the right of might. They infringed on the ability of the Dutch, the Netherlands to trade. They infringed on the ability of the Danes, the Swedes, were strong enough perhaps to make sure they could trade between both on their own terms. Even the Swiss were persuaded by the French to lean on the side of French influence. Of course, they're a landlocked country, so they have a certain motivation. So when push comes to shove, I think it becomes critically clear that when these coalitions form, the neutral states have to make a consideration of their own self-interest. And here, the conflict of Ukraine, again, let's call them the coalitions of powerful, one led by the United States, and one, well, rather more ambiguous in terms of, so Russia, Putin, or somebody else. And the role of states caught in between the neutrals, be it India or called China, that is rather complicated by where you fit between these great powers of coalition.
Thank you so much. I think this is a good point to introduce our case studies. First, we have Yemen. So for you guys that maybe don't know about this, Yemen's civil war began in 2014, following the Houthis takeover of the capital Sana'a and subsequent Saudi-led intervention. This conflict originated from long-standing political instability, with the Houthi opposing a Saudi-backed transitional government installed after the 2011 Arab Spring. The Houthis now control 70% of the Yemen's population, but lack international recognition. They maintain close ties with Iran, receiving military and logistical support, which has fueled regional proxy tensions. Saudi Arabia is strongly backed by the US, has received many weaponry, and the US has even provided them with refueling over Yemen, which allowed them to hold great bombing campaigns over the civilization. Ukraine and Russia, I think you guys are more, it's a more recent conflict. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea after a pro-Russian president was ousted, and Ukraine's Maidan Revolution. Since then, there has been a constant conflict in Crimea, and in 2022, Russia launched its extensive military invasion, and the US has since strongly backed Ukraine and also a lot of European countries, and now that Trump is becoming president in the US, it is unclear what the support for Ukraine look like and how NATO will stand in this conflict. With this in mind, what does neutrality mean with these two cases in mind, and especially let's focus on Yemen first. What does it mean when states fight a war on the soil of a different state, with like a proxy war like we can see in Yemen? How do we draw the lines of neutrality and support, or humanitarian support? Maybe Dr. Ruiz, if you want to start. If my question was clear, I don't know if I.
Maybe you could say a little more.
About my question?
Yeah.
I was wondering, what does neutrality mean? Where do we draw the line between humanitarian aid in a conflict like Yemen, or actively supporting the side, and what does it mean to be neutral in a conflict like that?
Well, that conflict is really quite bizarre, right? Because it's a mixture of a civil war between, at times, 3 different sides, and then you've got a coalition of Middle Eastern states that have intervened in that civil war to try to topple one element of that sort of, I don't know, triumvirate dispute or whatever. And you have the United States that, does support Saudi Arabia. So it's not exactly an easy case, because it's not like an interstate war properly, where we have like a recognized government of Yemen that is struggling against the sort of Saudi aggression or something like that. And so neutrality, as I would understand it, like in a sort of more conventional sense, is kind of difficult to pin down. Now, I think, and it sort of ties into like part of what you wanted to talk about today when it comes to like globalization or interconnection or something like that. Like, it would be very difficult to stay neutral in this kind of conflict, since some of the belligerents have actively aggressed the EU, right? They're launching missiles into the sea to try to destroy oil tankers and military ships. So it's not unreasonable for, another element of this, of course, is that the Houthis are aligned with the Iranians, and so the Houthis are, of course, launching ballistic missiles at Israel, but They're being supplied by Iran, so there's a blockade there to prevent like weapons from getting there. And so it's really quite messy. And so it makes a lot of sense for the United States to not be neutral at all, and I don't think that it is, right? When it comes to like some party that might be truly neutral, I don't know, like Papua New Guinea or something, well, they just, and I think it goes back to this question of interest, right? There's no interest in the area. The Houthis are not blowing up their shipping or disrupting their sea lines of communication, so why would Papua New Guinea care all that much? But I think it is very difficult for, especially commercial states, to be neutral when it comes to this conflict, simply because the risks to its interests are so great. Maybe that will help to start off
Yes,
the discussion.
definitely. I think my phrasing of the question was a little confusing. What I wanted to say is any country in these conflicts truly neutral in this globalized world, and what would that look like? Could a country like that supply aid to a war zone, and would that make it not neutral anymore? I think that was what I was getting at. Maybe Dr. Campbell, you touched on India and China in Ukraine. They claim that they're neutral or have a neutral stance. How do you think that makes sense?
Well, I think as we've heard, these are very, very complex examples in terms of the many layers of competing interests in proxy conflict, and also self-interest as a nation state, and simply the fact that in the case of China, they don't simply align themselves with what the United States and what's called NATO, EU have proclaimed to be just cause in the conflict, because they are having a deeper relationship with Russia. I don't think it necessarily means that China is not allowed to calculate its own interest. Perhaps it needs to calculate, given what's at stake, supporting Russia versus the continued relationship with the United States, economically its largest trade partner, the two largest trading partners in the world. But even in the case of India, which likewise is perhaps more, I'll call it genuinely neutral, taking perhaps from the perspective of self-interest, what is in India's best interest. Maybe cheap oil from Russia is in its interest. But it has to calculate where it stands between these sort of two competing coalitions. And again, India is perhaps by its actions contributing to a war on the doorstep of the European Union, which is India's second, European Union is India's second largest trade partner. And the trade relationship between them is rather a significant, bigger than that of the United States. And so for these countries to make their calculations on the basis of neutrality, again, there's just, I think, no getting away from the fact that you're making a calculation based on what you perceive your self-interest. And maybe there are advantages, maybe there are costs, maybe there are short, long-term calculations here. But Swiss neutrality is not something that I think we see much of, even from the Swiss in this conflict. So I think Switzerland is part of an EU program providing aid to Ukraine, at least in 2022 it was. So this strict neutrality is almost an ideal that when push comes to shove in the real world is very hard to sustain unless you are very, very determined to stick to your neutrality. Again, the closer you look some of these cases, like perhaps Switzerland in World War II, World War I, however valiantly they tried to maintain neutrality, in practical terms they have big difficulties.
Yeah, so Dr. Garner.
I don't agree. I also want to start by noting the how American it is to try to appropriate the British concept of a cube and pretend that it's called line. I want to see cultural imperialism at work. There it is. But I think that actually the question is a little strange. First, this idea that globalization is new, or like we're ever increasingly globalized every day in every way, is largely a myth. First of all, globalization is very old. Trading relationships are very old and distant, and when we look at some of the practice, the customary law that then eventually resulted in positive law, it wasn't always positive law, these kind of cases and worries have been around for a very long time. So it's true it's hard for Germany and Poland to be neutral, but in your globalized world, what about Bolivia's deep interest in Ukraine? There are many states like Bolivia. What about Malta? Malta has an official policy of neutrality, it's in their constitution. Malta's in the European continent last time I checked. So it is certainly the case that maybe people don't always live up to their claims of neutrality, but we're talking about what neutrality is as a status and what kind of rights and duties it imposes. It's quite clear. You are either providing direct material aid to the conflict and favoring a party, or you are not. You're allowed to preserve your status quo ante. There was trade relations between India and Russia long before the war erupted, and there was no obligation under either international law as positive or customary law or any moral theory saying you must immediately end all trade. Now, one of the points that you did ask I want to address is, when is it humanitarian? First of all, humanitarian aid is not some weird indirect thing. We don't say, well, if we first supply enough tanks, then we stop the war, then we help the nice little kids. Humanitarian aid is not some sort of indirect provision of eventual security and peace and justice. Humanitarian aid is the ability to provide things for immediate relief, food, medicine, whatever. So when people are complaining about humanitarian aid not reaching Gaza, no one thinks it means, well, if you give them enough AKs and they beat the Israelis, then we'll get the aid. Right? So we actually have a pretty clear understanding what humanitarian aid would be. Now, some powers will get angry. Israel is quite fussy about what they allow in, and part of their claim is what's going in might be presented as building materials, but we know it's going to be used to build rockets. But so far as I can tell, no one's ever managed to transform rice into rockets yet, so the rice at least could be uncontroversial, and vaccines and band-aids. So just like Target that was brought up, mixed targets or dual-use purposes, there are materials that are clear. No one really believes that gauze band-aids or antiseptics are necessarily favoring Hamas. That's plausibly just pure straight humanitarian aid. But if you start saying things like petrol or cash that can be spent in any way, now it's a little more ambiguous and difficult. And I think that has to be considered. I don't know the Yemen conflict as well as I think Christopher, but I would just say, yeah, anyone who's propping up proxy war cannot by definition be neutral, because you can't successfully fund your proxy and not be involved in war making. That's not anyone's definition of neutrality. So, and you're allowed not to be neutral, but then you can't claim the rights of neutrality. So if the Houthis fire on American ships, they can say, well, you're arming the people who are fighting, you get to fire back on us, but what you can complain is when we do target you, that it's some sort of war crime. That's not the case. But if you do target Malta, I don't know why the Houthis would, but if they did target Malta, then the Maltese could very well say, very simply, we're a neutral party, we have no involvement, and any targeting of either our state or our people would be a violation of international law, quite clearly so.
Yeah, I mean, that all sounds pretty good, except I guess the Houthis are not really a state, right? So
that doesn't really matter, because in many cases, it's effective control that establishes how we treat them. So you don't have to be a state party to have combatants recognized under the Geneva Conventions. And effective control of territory is very often essential to determine whether it becomes something like a purely internal matter, where it would be interference with them, or whether it starts to look like something like a conventional war. So it's very, very important to be able to point out that there's a difference between something like a low-level insurrection, where we say it's really interference in internal affairs, and something like effective control over a large amount of territory where someone really assumes a duty of the state. So if you think about Vietnam, you could say North Vietnam is not legitimate, but if it's effectively controlling 2/3 of the country or something like that, then to pretend that it's not a participant anymore in international affairs is largely an illusion. There are great cases, I agree. It's not always easy how you cross that threshold where it becomes a kind of de facto power, the way that the Confederate States were recognized as a de facto power, despite the fact that they are rebels. I suspect that they'd only conquered one city, it'd be different.
yeah, that might be right, but in the case of the Hague Convention, right, you have to be a signatory, right? So that where we outline the rights and obligations of neutral powers, you sign that treaty, you join the treaty, it's recorded in the country, and it's sent out to everyone else. So it's not exactly, we're not exactly only talking about customary international law here, and so that's what makes the Houthi situation a little bit different, I think. But besides that, when it comes to like, I totally agree with you on. I was just thinking of India or China in respect to Ukraine. I totally agree with you on a positivist view of international law. It's totally fine to maintain whatever oil trade you might have previously had with the Russians, or in the case of the Chinese, who I think are actually trying to very scrupulously adhere to the standard for neutrals under the Hague Convention. They're not supplying lethal weaponry officially that we can prove. They're supplying stuff like jet engines and drones and stuff. Yeah, you can attach a grenade to that drone, or an artillery shell, or build an aircraft with that jet engine. So it's a dual-use item, but that's not banned by those conventions, right? So, and the Chinese, of course, are trading in much larger quantities with the Russians. Okay, so in a certain way, on the positivist view of international law, the Chinese are actually much more neutral than the United States is in the Ukraine conflict. Now, but if you say the positive international law is actually not sufficient for understanding how states do and ought to engage in international politics, that in fact something like an appeal to justice or a common standard of justice is necessary, well, maybe it actually is indefensible for the Chinese to keep trading with the Russians, because we think, now maybe some of you are Russians and you're like, no, it belongs to us, it's been ours since the 11th century, whatever. But most people in the West tend to think the Russians are an unjust aggressor. And so maybe you say, listen, India, or listen, China, what you're doing is aiding and abetting a clearly unjust action. You are destabilizing the international order and international society, and you do have a duty, actually, to cease engaging in the kinds of trade that you are. You are not actually a neutral. You are a supporter of the Russians. And now, I'm not saying that this is the right view. I'm just saying that it is a view, and it is the view, I think, of actually many Western countries, the United States being one of them, that embraces this concept of qualified neutrality. Now, you could choose the other view. I'm not saying which is correct. I'm just trying to point out distinctions.
So I partially agree with that, but I think maybe we're talking past each other in a way. I think one question is whether anyone should be neutral is very different than what neutrality means. And the question as you posed, I think, was a little more descriptive about what neutrality means. Now, whether you should be neutral is another question. In fact, I think the pressure is on people to explain why neutrality is defensible, because people like to say, well, you should be on the side of justice and the small guy or whatever, and stop the rape of Belgium if they're thinking of World War I. Just trying to point out that America, I think, if it wants to make the case that it should support Ukraine, fine. But I don't think what it can do is say we're at once providing direct material aid, and if Russia were to strike us or strike back, that would be indefensible. If you want to take up the side of justice, then you should put on your big boy pants and assume that you're no longer immune to attack. And I think that's only fair. And that's fine, and I think that's what they should be prepared to do. And this is partially why it's so uneasy, is because these European countries have, very plausibly so, taken up on the side of justice. But if they're no longer neutral, then they can't pretend that both they are on the side of justice and helping the war being fought, and then say that if the Russians were to strike us, it'd be illegal. That's not the case. In terms of China, I actually think it's a real question whether they're scrupulously adhering to it. I think they're trying to appear. I very much agree with you that they're working very hard to look neutral. But I think the standard has shifted, and if it's not just weapons today, but also things like war materials, or if you change your trade policies to favor one side, then plausibly that is no longer the status quo ante. So if you raise by 300% your oil importations to help that country, then we could plausibly say, even under strict adherence to positive law, you're no longer neutral. China, stop pretending. So I would argue that positive law can probably be used to criticize China. I think they're working hard to cover their own posteriors. I'm not sure how successful it will be, but I certainly agree. I think they're working hard to appear as neutral as they can. So I think that's right.
I want to give the word to Dr. Campbell. Do you have anything on this topic?
I think, again, I think I've raised some rather important distinctions here, but I'm going to come back to that point just of coalitions and the fact that Ukraine has been the victim of Russian aggression is not in itself necessarily making the case that one must support Ukraine against that Russian aggression, however much we might, from a certain perspective, believe that that was the just cause to support. And just because one coalition of powerful countries led by the United States, comprising mostly the European Union and NATO, have chosen to support on the basis that this is a just cause, does not make it necessary that the rest of the world has to follow their lead. And what it comes down to is, again, individually, perhaps collectively, you're choosing to follow what you perceive to be your best national interest. And if that means aligning yourself with the United States, with the European Union in this conflict, that is going to come down to that calculation. If it's something else, then it's something else. And look at South Africa that hosted the summit. I mean, just because the world's sole proclaimed superpower has chosen one side of the conflict doesn't mean, in spite of the power of the American financial and banking system, imposed and forming, that everybody else has to follow in suit. Now, I don't say that it's a wrong thing for the United States to exercise its influence, its financial leverage. I don't think that it's wrong for the European Union to think very seriously about the countries that are perhaps, well, let's call it what it is. You're funding the Russian war effort. You're making it possible for the killing to continue at this terrible, horrific scale. But it, strictly in terms of our international norms and ideas about neutrality, we can't simply say that because the strong, the rich, and the powerful have chosen sides, everybody else has to get behind us.
Yeah, I think maybe I will give this back to you, Evan. You mentioned the rise of the American superpower. After the two world wars, do you think the meaning of neutrality has changed because of that?
I think in almost an international law technical sense, it has, to the extent that the new international institutions, and you pointed out the Swiss joined the United Nations after much trepidation. I think it was a referendum. Sweden and Finland have joined NATO. Austria has become a member of the European Union along with Sweden and Finland. So some of the strict neutrality that had sort of characterized the period of the Cold War has eroded since the end of the Cold War. You're quite right about the globalization being sort of the world economically was globalized very significantly before 1914, but between 1919. But after the Cold War, the international financial trade and the infrastructure of integration has meant that, as we can see, these trade relationships almost preclude, in the case of Switzerland, they are no longer able, strictly as a Swiss neutral country, to deal with the European Union. They have to sort of comply with EU trading laws in order to serve their own interests. And I think that's what perhaps has changed significantly.
Maybe Dr. Ruiz, a little bit on what has changed since the world wars, the meaning, international law, and neutrality.
I think you said it pretty well. I think that's pretty good.
I partially agree. It's certainly the case that some of these organizations did not exist before the world wars. NATO, for example, clearly did not exist in 1917 or 1817. That's true. But if we're going to be cynical, then we should be cynical not half the time, but all the time. And Ireland is a member of the EU, has been for a while, and Ireland has a policy of neutrality. Now that's a bit of a conflict with some of its actual commitments. So there are many groups who have treaty obligations they selectively follow or selectively enforce. So I would say that this kind of, international organizations and this idea that, they have all this might and power, I think this is partially true at best. More than one member of NATO doesn't live up to its spending requirements, and nearly none of them could actually fight for a whole week if they had to live up to their obligations. So I think a lot of countries sign empty pieces of paper, pretend to care about norms or new conventions, but a lot of the actual practice remains unchanged. if Ireland wanted to live up to its defence commitments and the various organisations it belongs to, it couldn't. Canada could not, for that matter. Anyone gone ho on Canada not being neutral, in March 2024, we discovered that 54% of all of our military vehicles are inoperable. Not saying the other half are in good state, that's just half of them, slightly more than half, can't even function. Not for a day, let alone a week or a month. So, maybe we've also signed some piddling piece of paper that you think Justin will honor. I have to admit, if we're going to be cynics, we should be cynics all the way through. I think a lot of the international hand-waving is empty, perfectly frank.
Thank you. Maybe a quick look into the future. Maybe connecting to the Ukraine conflict, what does neutrality mean for the future? And could a neutral Ukraine, like the neutral stance of Ukraine in the future be a valuable option, or would that just change nothing?
If I understand your question, I think that Ukraine is in some way kind of a possible pivot point. So I take what Dr. Garner says about sort of treaties not meaning a whole lot in practice, probably. And I think that's very true. And so neutrality, if push came to shove, actually might make a big comeback. And I think in a more obvious way, the Ukraine war is perhaps the beginning of a more explicit movement towards, more neutral states. So you've got, with this war, this sort of accretion of a counter-Western bloc in Russia, China, Iran, Syria, basically all the states that don't get along with the West, North Korea, whatever. And the Chinese are quite busy trying to usher in a period of multipolarity. And so at present, the sort of Western or Washington consensus, the sort of Western-backed international system, might be in a kind of way on the wane, right? States may no longer feel in the future that they have to actually say they're going to toe the Western line. They might just say, we're not getting involved because of their interests, or they have different ideas about the good and justice or something. And so my guess is that Ukraine is actually a sign of things to come. So we're getting this solidified anti-American, anti-Western bloc, and that frees up a lot of other countries to take a more neutral stance than they would have otherwise. Am I making sense to you? Yeah.
I agree partially with that, but I think I parse it slightly differently. First, I think that there is an anti-American bloc, or anti-Western bloc maybe, or anti-NATO bloc. You can, but I also think there's probably a very large part that has nothing to do with technically anti-Western. It's more something like fed up Western, stop lecturing us bloc, which I think is probably bigger. If you look at things like trade and activity, so initially Russia invades February 2022, there's mass condemnation, but very quickly we see that status quo ante kind of resumes. A lot of people felt like, look, we had to vote the UN, we said they were bad, like get off our backs. If you're Haiti, if you're Bolivia, if you're Paraguay, what are you realistically going to do, or some small island Pacific? I think you mentioned Papua New Guinea. So I think that, yeah, some states are actively engaged with a far more aggressive kind of counter-movement, China, Iran, Russia. I think there's this, other group, and maybe India is more interested in this kind of like, I think Modi was very clear recently, he doesn't want to just join some anti-American, anti-Western bloc. He's interested in, the idea that we're not going to take foreign policy instructions from daddy and mummy in some foreign capital. Often, I also like to underline, worth thinking about the colonial inheritance here in many of these cases. If you're India, you might be sick and tired of thinking that somehow whatever London or the Parliament comes up with has to be somehow imitate or Xeroxed in New Delhi. I suspect that bloc is not quite the exact same thing as the Russian-China bloc.
I think that's an important point, because not supporting the lead of the United States or the West is not the same as being anti-United States or the West. Again, I think it simply comes back to a calculation, a rational calculation of your own self-interest. And where they align, you're going to be more willing to support, back it. But it's also raising I think questions of, maybe you'd be more technically capable of detailing this, but the idea that you're making international treaties that are just a scrap of paper, the pretext, the dispute, are written to support Belgium, France, Russia, World War I, the 1839 treaty, creating Belgium and guaranteeing its neutrality, backed by the 5 great powers at the time. Well, the December 5th, 94 Budapest Memorandum, by which Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons back to the safekeeping of Russia, was guaranteed by Russia, the United States, the UK, and Ukraine. You know, these international guarantees, which again, are the foundation of Swiss neutrality of the Congress of Vienna, guaranteed by the international great powers, these European great powers. What do those guarantees actually mean in this international law environment if, when push comes to shove, again, the calculations come down to, well, does it serve our interests or not to live up to these agreements? And I think that's where, well, we can't help but be cynical, can we?
I mean, partially cynical. There is self-sacrifice for our limited, what we might call parochial altruistic actions. So, okay, I'll just point out, Ireland and Malta have so-called policies of neutrality, but neutrality is supposed to come with enforcement. So if you're neutral, you're supposed to deny use of your territory to belligerents. They're not allowed to use your territory to deploy weapons, move troops, things like that. And that requires you having some ability to enforce it. Ireland and Malta have a better chance at taking the invaders to the bar than fighting back. Switzerland, that's not so true. Switzerland has a network of bunkers and bombs wired to a lot of bridges and roadways. Switzerland actually has taken seriously the idea of actually defending its own neutrality. So I'm all for the fact that we're torn between interest and principle. I'm not sure interest in the naked sense always wins. But I also wanted to just point out that, so I agree self-interest matters, but self-interest can also be interpreted in a, either it's not self-interest or it's a different interpretation, but pride and identity matter a great deal. Resentment towards smug, lecturing former colonial powers, I don't think it's always just about self-interest, that you can actually bring out a spreadsheet and add up the benefits. If you ignore that one of those benefits is something like self-respect or pride or some sense of dignity, and not being subservient anymore, and that's usually not what we mean by self-interest and kind of like hard-nosed, cash, how many divisions of the Pope has type view. So I think either we need to broaden the view of self-interest, or we have to accept that in some of these cases, it's not quite just a kind of cold, hard calculation. There is something that's moral or psychological or a mix of both, and I wouldn't underestimate that.
You go as far as to say a collective self-interest in international law, international institutions for security?
I mean, it's like the treaties, we're pretending it works. Oh, now it it's certainly the case you can believe that I'm not protecting you out of altruism, I'm protecting you because I believe I'll be protected in turn. But that kind of rationality is always hostage to prisoner's dilemmas, where you decide to defect first. And defection is, of course, a pattern, as you know. The Melians thought the Spartans would come to their aid, fat chance, even if the Spartans eventually won the war. So that is, I know, I make them read the Melian dialogue too. But there is some, real attempt to live up to certain ideals. I just think that we should not be overly optimistic about it. People do rush into burning buildings to save strangers, but if you think that everyone will do it every time there's a burning building, then you have a wildly idealistic view. But to deny that anyone does it, I think, is equally fanciful. So I think if we have a moderate and sober view of idealism, self-sacrifice, then we're not too much in danger. But I wouldn't want to be 100% cynical either. That makes sense.
So now you're not 100% cynical.
No, I said I'm not used to being the least cynical person.
Well, I just want to read from the Melian dialogue the bleak conclusion that perhaps is the ultimate expression of cynicism from the side of the Athenians. We both know that the decisions about justice are made in human discussions only when both sides are under equal compulsion. But when one side is stronger, it gets as much as it can, and the weak must accept that.
Okay, I think that's a good, maybe a good way to wrap it up, maybe not. I will look at some questions from the audience now. Okay, one is, I will just ask it to the panel and whoever feels free. How should we think about the relationship between neutrality and isolationism? Can you have one without the other?
Yes. The less demanding stance is neutrality. Neutrality does not mean perpetual neutrality. It can mean that, but it need not mean that. So, for example, if Peru or Paraguay don't have a position on Ukraine, or have renounced a position, they might have done so, you could always backtrack and remove yourself from something. That doesn't mean that they are committed to isolationism. Isolation would be the stronger claim. So if you're a true isolationist, then it seems very hard to see how you would be committed to some sort of aggressive armed neutrality, some sort of bunker USA or whatever. But neutrality does not entail isolationism, right? You can be neutral on a case-by-case basis, and realistically, probably almost every state is neutral to most conflicts, and they really only fight in neutrality about a select few, right? I've told you there are 45 conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa. We've only touched on arguably one with Yemen. What about the other 44?
Anyone want to?
I think that is an interesting distinction, but again, it's probably a little bit needing too much qualification. Even under the period of isolationism following the failure to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and join the League of Nations, the United States from 1919 to 1929, 1939 even was rather engaged diplomatically, financially. It funded the reparations until the Great Depression. But I think it is, if we think of any country that has actually truly been totally isolationist, that they're almost non-players, non-actors in the international environment. Maybe Nepal before China. But
Japan for a while?
yeah, guarded, forced isolationism.
Yeah.
Korea at various points in time, but I think it's an unusual case.
Thank you so much. The next question is, if the UN requires member states to provide troops for war, how come this mobilization has not occurred since the Korean War?
I think we need to qualify the Korean War because, number one, the Soviet Union had objected to participating on the Security Council because it had chosen Taiwan, China, to be the veto-wielding great power, member of the Security Council. So in the absence of the Soviet Union, the United Nations made a resolution to require military support for South Korea, and only the great allies of the United States, Turkey, Greece following the Truman Plan, and Canada, Australia, countries that really thought alignment with the United States was necessary, actually participated with Great Britain. It wasn't a general United Nations support for this cause. And I don't think it will ever be able to compel military support unless there is a compelling self-interest in doing so.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing to add on to that is that my understanding is that to mobilize the UN and to be able to call on those military forces, the Security Council has to make that finding. And the reason the Security Council hasn't done that since then, since USSR was boycotting the UN at the time, it didn't veto UN participation in Korea. But when it comes to something like Ukraine, well, who inherited the USSR's veto in the Security Council? Russia, right? And so Russia's going to veto that. So you don't get those kinds of operations anymore because more likely than not, a permanent member of the Security Council is going to veto it, or they're just going to do it themselves, right? So maybe the United States doesn't need a whole UN action to intervene in Libya or something like that when they can do it much more easily through NATO or something like that.
Yes, I entirely agree that the reason you get this weird exception is because of this weird exceptional case where the person who could stop it didn't stop it, and then since then they've learned their lesson and you really don't get any repeat cases. But I would just point out that even an organization you might think of as less Care Bear-like and effete and impotent, NATO, most of its members don't live up to its obligations at all. Most of those armies are paper armies that aren't worth the paper they're written on. There's only a handful of them that are actually capable of any sort of sustained operations, and most of those are diminished by compared to their historical predecessors. The British and the French are nowhere near what they used to be. So you might just point out, it's not really the UN, it's just this is a general problem that Free riding on others is a huge problem, and a lot of people who've spent a long time criticizing Americans, I'll be on your side for this, criticizing Americans for their immense military spending, it's because so many other states have just decided to live under their umbrella. And that's the real, those are the facts of the case. I mean, NATO's treaty obligations are almost as laughable as UN declarations.
Thank you. Next question is it better for world welfare for states to act based on self-interest or ideology / natural laws?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. Is it better for world welfare for states to act based on self-interest or ideology / natural law?
I'm sure you want to say something after this. I think it's unclear, and I think anyone who's too confident for either side should think long and hard. If you take the side of just war theory or natural law, or whatever, this idea that you should act on principles greater than just self-interest, turns out there's a lot of opportunities for justice. Just what every intervention you think is a botched Western initiative can claim some degree of justice, some degree of humanitarian aid, some ability to protect some minority from greater oppression. So it turns out that while on the one hand you might think the isolationists are selfish bastards who won't help those in need, it turns out justice can very quickly become into an excuse to be perpetually at war. In fact, I don't know if you know this, but amazingly, Rome never fought an unjust war. Every war Rome fought, they at least thought they were doing the just thing. So, and isolationists, their selectivity can in some way favor actual peace. Many American realists like Mearsheimer were deadly against things like the war in Iraq. So if you think the war in Iraq is one of the worst recent Western adventures, turns out the realists were against that. And people like just war theorists were a little too enthusiastic. So I would say it's not obvious that there's some sort of timeless, acontextual rule that like the justice people are better and the realists are worse. It turns out realists can be less bloodthirsty because they're growing to be prudent, and it turns out that those on the side of justice can be willing to tear things down because they've got big principles and they think it makes it all right. So I'd be wary and would want a more case-by-case analysis.
Yeah, I think I basically agree. On Iraq, I don't know, I mean, so yeah, Mearsheimer, he writes that op-ed with Waltz. That's right. On the other hand, you might have different ideas like Saddam Hussein's, whether or not he's as reasonable as we think we would be in his situation. And so you might be mirror imaging a little bit. So not all realists would necessarily agree with that. I think the better case is actually Afghanistan. And whether or not it was just to leave women in Afghanistan to be subjugated under the Taliban, to not be educated, to not be allowed to drive, etc. Did the United States commit a grave injustice in toppling the Taliban and letting it come back or something like that? Even though it might not really be in our interest to stay there, which is the argument, right? But I do agree, like, in practice, you should never go one way or the other. To do that is to sort of think that you have made of international politics a science, when in fact what you should be doing is thinking about it in terms of prudence. You can never have perfect knowledge, so when you think you're doing something just, you may be unaware of some facts that make your interpretation wrong, and so you should be very cautious about committing the young in your country to die on the field of battle for something you're not totally sure about. As we talked about in my intro to IR class, there's a concept called the order of charity, right? So the idea is that you owe much more to the people closer to you in your life. So as a human being, you owe more to your family members, to your children, to your statesmen, and then to human beings, right? And so while you may be witnessing, if you're, say, Joe Biden, while you may be witnessing an injustice in Ukraine, and you could say, that the Russians are violating the international law. Well, you might also be committing a kind of injustice if you want to correct that injustice with American troops or a risk of American conflict, America being involved in that conflict. Well, you might also want to weigh that against the possibility that you're going to be sending your young men to die on the field of battle. And that's not always an easy call. It's not an obvious call to make, and so you have to use some prudence and judgment. And that's what makes, I think, international politics so interesting, is that you can't do international politics by algebra. So you have ideologues who think that you can always be super just, or you have, sort of hard-nosed realists who think, well, it's all about the balance of power. I don't think so. I think you have to go somewhere. Both of those sort of poles are important, but you have to put yourself somewhere in the middle, so that you don't get you and yourself your own killed or destroyed, but also so that you don't do things that human beings ought not do, like facilitate genocide or something like that.
Thank you. Do you want to touch on that?
I think I would just like to reinforce that point. It is not simply a question of blood and treasure, but to calculate, to think hard, to think twice perhaps, because it's almost, if we look at particularly the last 30 years, the willingness to intervene is almost far out of proportion to the wisdom of intervening. And with the benefit of hindsight, which is obviously an easy one to look backwards from, most of those interventions were made without really understanding, even the ones that we think were successful, perhaps Bosnia, Yugoslavia, have a lot of qualification to them, and the cost to your own, I think it was 161 Canadian soldiers and diplomats were killed in the Canadian mission in Afghanistan, and we can question perhaps some of the wider purposes, but you have to think very, very hard before sending most of them young people like you, who serve their country with their lives for a cause that maybe with the benefit of hindsight, really, what did it serve our interests?
Thank you so much. Next question is, if Iran funds the Houthis and they blow up an American ship by proxy, can we claim Iran is blowing up American ships, especially if they are being majorly funded by Iran?
No, technically it's not Iran blowing them up, but Iran is directly participating in the Houthi war effort. Those are just distinct things. You can be an accessory to murder without being technically a murderer, or you can be an accessory to a crime without necessarily being the person who's committing it. So we can establish things like degrees of responsibility or degrees of guilt. That's not exactly a conceptual miracle. So yeah, if you're directly involved, if two proxies are directly involved in participation in a conflict, then yeah, they no longer have a neutral status. Doesn't mean we have to start ascribing directly everything to them. But just to touch upon the prudence that I think Christopher and Todd are both talking about very wisely, is that the fact you might have the right to target another state or their people, you might think having a right and exercising are two different things. So you might say, yeah, technically right now maybe Russia could strike America and America could strike Russia, neither of them are neutral towards each other. But if they actually did it, not just thought about it, then that would immediately escalate the conflict and make things worse. So perhaps part of prudence is realizing there's a difference between having a right and the fact that it's a good idea to exercise that right.
Anyone want to? Okay. What are the differences, similarities between natural law and customary law?
Still hard this actually. To make it quick, customary law is basically what you might think of as like common law without the courts. It is established practice and precedent, and where we learn from those that we think to basically admire or think are good guides to our action. So customary law is basically looking at how past wars have been waged, past states have behaved, what the international reaction is, things like that. Natural law does not take as a starting point how people behave, because natural laws can also want to say, well, even if they've done these things, we have a custom, we might still submit the custom or the practice to rational critique. Essentially, natural law is, kind of a moral theory take on the world. I would just point out that one of the difficulties about natural law is you presume that you can identify an actual common law between all human beings, and it turns out universalism is not that uncontroversial. What appears natural and obvious. So here's a real-world example. A lot of what we call just war theory is largely a secularized version of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And when this was applied in Germany, it wasn't as controversial in Nuremberg because the Germans are obviously part of the Western world. When this was applied in the tribunals for the Far East against Japan, the Japanese were pretty angry about this because they very explicitly rejected these norms. This is your view of war, not ours. And in the proceedings, they were not alone. There was an Indian judge who wrote a dissent, pointing out that this is just, what you call natural law is just basically, Catholic thought with some secular terms, wielded by American lawyers to tell the Japanese how they should live. So the question of whether or not morality is culturally relative or universal is a deep and difficult question. You're allowed to have your views, but you should at least be sober enough to realize that smart people will disagree with you. The benefit of something like customary or even positive laws, at least you can point to it and say, look, maybe this is not ideal justice or perfect justice, but this is something real that we can observe and agree on. And practice between or across cultural lines can have some value. May not need to have some high abstraction to say, at least we could agree it's a pretty decent practice, whatever your ultimate theory or justification. So it's a difficult question. It's one reason why maybe we should be wary of too much high theory.
I think that's right. I think the only thing I'd say is that, especially as an American, I won't speak for Canadians, but you know, Declaration of Independence. I know that some of you in my classes have read the Declaration of Independence, and it claims that, you know, we are all endowed with certain unalienable rights by our Creator, right? And so yes, it does in fact involve an appeal to God, and yes, in fact, your belief in human rights, if you have that belief, is a secularized version of that. But that's something you need to grapple with. I don't think that because it's a difficult question, it's something you should not have strong feelings about. And so I'll leave it at that, I guess, in that the United States is, why do we abolish slavery? Why is it wrong to enslave human beings? Is it wrong by nature to do so? If you think yes, then you have some implicit, or if you don't really understand it very well, some undeveloped idea of something like natural law within you. If you think it's, oh, well, you know, some guys just did it, wouldn't matter, well, then maybe you're a positivist, right? And you just think that the law is whatever a legislature passes. And so these are serious questions that might take your whole life, my whole life. I'm not telling you I have all of the answers, but and I'm not prepared to persuade you on every detail. But this sort of question is sort of the foundation of much of international politics, especially from the perspective of a liberal democracy. I agree with you that many other countries don't agree. They're like, this is crazy. You're sort of foisting your ideas upon us. And the answer is yes. In fact, you shouldn't throw certain people off of roofs. Yes, you should allow women to drive and vote. These ideas are true and good. And just as, you know, Rome shows up to Carthage and, you know, stops the human sacrifices, or the British show up to India and say, hey, you're not going to burn your widows anymore. That might be a good thing. But it does require a theoretical foundation, and it's something that you have to take seriously and actually go to the bottom of. I know Riley, of course, being a Darwinist, won't agree, but anyway, that's all I have to say. But I think you're right.
I would just add one thing. So I think it's very respectable and to actually to point out where your starting point is and not try to hide behind some vague we or, you know, whatever. So I think that's right, Christopher. I would just point out one thing about overlap, which is that the fact we might agree on things like the abolition of slavery, it's still possible to have the same endpoint with very different arguments. So it could be the case that you aren't a Christian or you're not a universalist, but you still have some argument against slavery. So I wouldn't want to draw too much from the fact that we can have overlap, because in fact the overlap can, you know, the consequentialist argument against capital punishment and the deontological argument against capital punishment are very different, and they would, you know, spell out very different things in different contexts. But I certainly agree, and I think that's how we should engage as honestly about what our commitments are.
I hesitate to say anything because I feel like I might be sort of just tossing grenades, but yeah, when it comes down to moral codes or interpretations or cultural values, those who live by the sword die by the sword. If you want to start a war and lose it, what are your grounds of complaint? You know, if somebody else imposes their will upon you, their values upon you, well, you would have done the same that you want. And at the same time, these ideas of, I guess, justification really are maybe problematic. Rome did not go to war against Carthage to stop the sacrifices. One could even make a very technical argument that the United States North did not go to war against the Confederacy to end slavery. It was to keep the Union intact. I think Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia were slave states. So that, the moral justifications usually follow the declaration of war. And I think we need to be cautious about them. Again, put on your cynical hats, be very skeptical, and maybe look to the underlying self-interest, which is
Do you
Really
really want to
next
respond?
question.
Okay.
He knows I think he's too simple.
Can humanitarian aid ever serve as a basis for proving one's neutrality? Theoretically, you're not taking a state side, but of humanitarianism, would such a distinction even be relevant?
I'm not sure I understand the question. To prove your neutrality? Is that
For proving one's neutrality. Can humanitarian aid ever serve as a basis for proving one's neutrality? Because you're not taking a stand, but a stand for humanity.
I suppose you could, but I also suspect that you should not ignore the fact that the moment you do anything, people will suspect that whoever's doing something, providing aid, is like, well, are they actually favoring something? So if you've got roughly 200 states, let's imagine that you've got 2 states at war, and there's, over 190 who are neutral. If you decide to step on the pack and start offering aid, people will say, oh, what are they doing? Are they, I listen to Todd, I'm cynical. Do they really want to help? Why aren't they acting like everyone else? So, yeah, you could try to prove it, but people can be cynical and they can challenge your motives. Whether you stay home or you do something, you should do it if you want to help. You should not do it to prove you're neutral. You're already neutral by not participating.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, so I will do 1 or 2 more questions, depending on the answers. Does neutrality solely seek a lower amount of conflict, or is peace more of a side benefit?
So, look, I don't think neutrality just aims at peace, because neutrality is a right exercised by individual states. States the legal agent, but really it's communities. How is it in Haiti's interest to get involved in important wars? Or Malta, or Paraguay, or Sierra Leone? It's very easy when you're thinking about big states, Russia, America, France, Germany, whatever. The reality is most states in the world are far poorer, far weaker, and if they take a stand, it's not that they're necessarily going to make the world more peaceful or less peaceful, but they now become targets. And I'm not sure these poorer, weaker states, what is Jamaica's interest in siding with Israel or Gaza? Does Malta, really benefit from taking a side over Russia and Ukraine? So I think when we're thinking about the right of neutrality, ask yourself not, whether you think it's bad for a powerful country, but look at a world map for 30 seconds and think about all the people who can't afford any sustained war effort and don't want to be targets. And then you'll start to see why neutrality might have real attraction. It's really easy to focus on the big countries.
I really think that's an interesting and important point, because if we do think of it along those lines, and perhaps over the course of history, neutrality is an option for countries that are not great powers. Neutrality is an option for countries that would otherwise have their rights infringed upon by a conflict, by the struggle between the great powers. So having that option of neutrality, perhaps codified by international law, international rights of neutrality, is always going to be in the interest of those who are not great powers. And it's not a wrong thing or policy to not want to involve in struggles between great powers.
Okay, I think, thank you so much. That's really great.